Why Hazrat Khadija was so beloved to Prophet Muhammad. The sun had barely risen over Makkah when the city began to stir with life. Its markets were alive with traders calling out prices. Camels moved slowly through the streets, and women drew water from the wells. Among them was a woman unlike the rest, her eyes calm, her steps graceful, and her face marked by dignity. Her name was Khadija. She was known throughout Makkah as Tahira, the pure one. She was not just wealthy, she was respected and loved for her honesty and kindness. In a society where women were often dismissed, Khadija ruled her business empire with grace and fairness, and she did it without ever raising her voice. People trusted her, slaves loved her, and competitors feared her, not because she was harsh, but because she was just one. Day she stood at the edge of her courtyard listening to the report of a servant who had just returned from Syria with her caravan. The man paused and lowered his voice as he said, "There is one young man who stood out unlike any I have seen before. He was honest, he was gentle, he treated even the camels with care. His name is Muhammad." Khadija felt something stir inside her. She had heard his name before, the orphan boy raised by his uncle Abu Talib, the one who refused to lie even when it would profit him, the one who sat in silence while others laughed and mocked. He was different, and in a world of deception, she respected different. She arranged to meet him, not in private, through another trade expedition. This time she sent him with her goods and her most trusted servant, Maizara. What returned weeks later was not just profit, it was a story that Makkah could not stop speaking about. Muhammad had dealt fairly, he had prayed under the burning sun, he had refused shady deals, he had spoken kindly to the harshest of men, and Maizara had wept when he told Khadija about the way strangers treated him like a brother, simply because they felt peace in his presence. That night Khadija sat under the stars alone in her courtyard. The wind was soft and cool, but inside her chest something burned, not desire but admiration, not longing but awe. She had been married before twice, both times to men of status, but never to someone like this, someone who was noble, not because of his name but because of his soul. She sent a proposal not directly, but through a woman she trusted, Nafisa, who approached Muhammad with care. Muhammad did not rush, he spoke to his uncle, he prayed. Then he accepted, not for wealth, not for beauty, but because he saw in Khadija something few ever saw in any person: complete honesty, complete support, and a heart that already believed in the truth, even before it came down from the heavens. Their marriage was simple yet strong. The wedding had no celebration of gold, no drunkenness, no arrogance. It had smiles and prayers, and two people who stood side by side from the very beginning. It was not just love, it was partnership. It was the beginning of something the world had never seen. Years passed, and Khadija became the first to see what no one else could. When Muhammad returned from the cave of Hira, trembling, pale and frightened, saying that he had seen an angel that had wrapped him in light and commanded him to read it, was Khadija, who did not doubt him for even a moment. She held him, she covered him with a cloth, she told him he was not mad, she reminded him of who he was. You are good to your family, you carry the burden of the weak, you feed the poor, you honor guests, you support the truth. How can Allah ever disgrace a man like you? She took him to Waraka, her cousin, a scholar of the previous scriptures. Waraka listened carefully, then spoke in a firm voice, "This is the same angel who came to Musa, and if what you say is true, your people will turn against you, but if I live long enough, I will support you." From that moment on, Khadija never stopped standing beside him. When the world turned its back, she stood forward. When people called him a liar, she called him the truthful. When he was banned, when he was threatened, when stones were thrown, she bled with him, not physically, but in her soul. Her wealth was spent for his mission. Her home became a refuge. Her silence became a shield, and her prayers became a mountain behind him. And when the Muslims were pushed into the valley during the boycott, it was Khadija who bore the hunger, the thirst, and the pain without a word of complaint. One night, her body weakened, her breath became slow. The same woman who once commanded caravans across the deserts now lay on a simple bed, her hands in his, her eyes. Looking only at his face, she smiled, even as her chest tightened and the world faded. Her last words were full of peace and love, and her face was still smiling when her soul returned to its Lord. Prophet buried her with his own hands. He lowered her into the grave, and for days he spoke little. He smiled, lest the woman who believed in him when no one did was gone. The light of his home had dimmed, and the echo of her voice stayed in his heart forever. Years later, when someone mentioned her name, he would close his eyes and tears would rise. He would say, "She believed in me when no one else did. She gave me when others held back, and Allah blessed me with children through her." Even Aisha, the beloved wife of the Prophet, would feel the power of her legacy whenever she heard him speak of Khadija. His voice soft, his eyes distant, not because he loved less, but because he had loved once with a depth that shaped his soul. Khadija was not just special, she was chosen. She was not just a wife, she was the first believer, the first partner, the first shield. And in every step of the Prophet's journey, her presence walked beside him, in memory, in strength and heart. Her grave remains in Mecca, silent and simple, but in every heart that knows her story. She lives on, the woman who stood with the greatest man and helped him become the mercy to the worlds. Why Hazrat Khadija was so beloved to Prophet Muhammad. The days after Hazrat Khadija's passing were quiet, yet heavy in the house of the Prophet. His footsteps echoed with a stillness that even the birds outside seemed to feel, the smile that once welcomed every guest had faded, and the silence held more pain than words could ever explain. The companions noticed, but none dared to speak, for they knew what had been lost was not just a wife, but a companion in truth. He would sit in her room, often alone, sometimes picking up the cloth she had woven with her own hands, sometimes gently touching the small items she had gifted him years ago. His eyes would lower, not in grief alone, but in remembrance, in deep respect, in the kind of love that stays even after death. One morning, Fatima, his youngest daughter, walked in, her small feet tapping against the floor, her eyes wide with innocence and sorrow. She had not fully understood where her mother had gone, but she knew something precious was missing. She climbed into his lap, looked into his tired eyes, and said, "Will she come back?" The Prophet hugged her for a long time. Pressing his hand gently against her head, he whispered something soft into her ear, and though no one else heard it, her eyes filled with tears, and her arms clung tighter around his neck. Outside in the city, the Quraysh had grown louder, their voices full of hate, their faces burning with arrogance. They believed the Prophet had lost his strength. With Khadija gone, they believed he would now fall, that his message would die with his grief. But they had not known what kind of love lived inside him, and how her memory would become his strength. Began to walk through the markets again, delivering the message of Allah without fear, standing where no one dared to stand, and speaking what no one wanted to hear. But in his heart, he still carried the sound of her voice, and it gave him courage beyond understanding. One day, as he sat with his closest companions, someone brought an old necklace to him. It had been found in the spoils of a recent skirmish. The Prophet saw it, and his hand trembled slightly. His breath paused. It was Khadija's necklace, the one she had given to Zainab, their daughter, on her wedding. The companions watched as tears formed in his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he asked for it to be returned to Zainab without question, and then sat silently holding his chest, as if trying to hold her memory close to his heart. Her generosity, her warmth, her wisdom lived in every small thing she left behind. Later that night, he shared a dream with his companions. He said, "I saw Khadija in Jannah, in a palace made of pearls. There was no noise, no hardship, only peace, and I was told this is her reward for her sacrifice and her patience, for she never raised her voice, for she never hurt a soul, for she believed when the world called me mad." The companions were silent, their hearts heavy with awe. They understood now why no other name brought such pain and such peace to the Prophet at once. Even years later, when new companions came into his life, when new bonds were formed, And even when new marriages took place, no one could fill the place Khadija held in his soul when someone would speak her name. His eyes would light up when someone would offer something in her name. He would accept it with both hands as if she had returned for a moment through their kindness. Afisha once asked him, "Did you not find someone better than her?" And his face changed. Gently he replied, "She believed in me when no one else did. She supported me when all rejected me. She shared her wealth and soul for this mission. No, I never found anyone better than her. This was not a comparison. This was loyalty. This was a love that did not fade. This was truth spoken by the truest of men about the truest of women." People say love ends with death, but the Prophet showed the world that real love only begins when souls are connected by truth, by faith, by sacrifice, and by honor. Khadija did not need long poems or public praise. Her love was proven through actions, through tears, through every single time she stood when others fell. When the Prophet finally made hijrah to Medina, her absence was felt more than ever. She had longed to be there, to see Islam rise openly, to watch the message of the one God spread without fear. But Allah had chosen for her something better. She was given rest. She was given light. She was given honor beyond the sky. The Prophet often looked at the moon and thought of her, not because she had become a memory, but because she had become part of him. She was not behind him, she was within him. Her strength, her faith, her patience had carved themselves into his path, into his words, into his every moment of truth. During one quiet night in Medina, as he sat under the stars, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for her. And he knew that though the world would change, though cities would rise, though empires would fall, her name would live, her story would be told, and every believer who heard of her would say, "May Allah be pleased with her." This was no ordinary love. This was no ordinary woman. This was Khadija, the first to believe, the first to support, the one who never asked for anything but gave everything. And because of that, she remains the most beloved to the one who was sent as a mercy to all worlds. Why Hazrat Khadija was so beloved to Prophet Muhammad. As Islam began to rise in the heart of Medina, every stone, every tree, every shadow seemed to hold a memory of sacrifice, but none as deep as the memory of Khadija. When the Prophet walked through the narrow paths of Kuba, when he spoke to the people with mercy and hope, his voice carried strength, shaped long ago by her support, by her words, by her silence that always knew when to speak and when to listen. One evening, as the Prophet sat with his companions, an old woman approached, slowly leaning on a wooden staff. Her back bent, her steps slow but steady, her eyes filled with tears before she even spoke. And when the Prophet saw her, his face changed, his smile grew wide, and he rose to greet her gently. He placed his own cloak where she could sit and poured water for her himself. The companions were surprised. They had never seen him do this before for any stranger. When the woman left, they asked, "O Messenger of Allah, who was she?" He replied softly, "She was one of Khadija's friends. She used to visit our home, and Khadija honored her, and I still honor her because of that." The companions looked at one another, understanding in Kopandore that moment that love was not in grand displays, but in the smallest acts of loyalty. Even after death time passed, and the trials of prophethood grew harder, battles came, and wounds were many, betrayals followed victories, and nights were spent in prayer, not in comfort. Yet through all of it, the Prophet never forgot the roots from which his strength had first grown. Every decision, every sermon, every moment of truth carried echoes of Khadija's faith in him. In Qoti, the quiet of the night, as the Prophet prayed under the stars, there were times his tears would fall, not from fear, not from weakness, but from gratitude for the one who stood by him before the world believed in him. He remembered her words during the earliest days when he had returned trembling from the cave of Hira, when no one else could understand what he had seen. She had not just believed, she had protected him with her faith. There was a moment after the Battle of Uhud, when the Prophet stood at the edge of the field, his face covered in blood. His armor broken, his tooth lost, yet in his silence, there was peace. A companion asked him, what gave him strength? And he replied, Allah and the faith of those who stood with me in the beginning. Those like Khadija Fatima, who had grown into a wise and noble woman, often sat beside her father at night asking him questions about her mother. What was she like? What did she say? What did she do? The Prophet would speak softly, choosing his words with care. She was light, he said. She never raised her voice. She never doubted. She gave me everything without ever asking for return. When Fatima cried, he would hold her close, reminding her that her mother had left not pain behind, but legacy, and that legacy lived inside her, inside every woman who spoke truth with kindness inside. Every believer who stood for justice no matter the cost. Once, while the Prophet was dividing spoils after a victory, a woman approached and asked for something she claimed she had once served. Khadija, the Prophet, paused, handed her more than she asked for, and said, because you served her, you are honored today. And the woman wept, not from greed but from the memory of her mistress who had been so loved, so remembered. Years later, when revelation came to speak of the wives of the Prophet, Khadija's name was not included among those mentioned in Surah Ahzab, not because she was forgotten but because she was beyond comparison. She was the only one whom the Prophet never married alongside anyone else during her life. She had no equal in that house, no rival, no competition, only honor, only devotion. The Prophet once said, the best of the women of paradise are Maryam, the daughter of Imran, Aisha, the wife of Pharaoh, Khadija, the daughter of Khuwaylid, and Fatima, my daughter, placing Khadija among the 4 greatest women to ever walk this earth. Every time he broke his fast, he would remember how Khadija would wait for him with food and water, and a soft word of care every time he stood in the night prayer. He remembered how she would rise and stand beside him, even in her old age, even when her body was weak, but her spirit never was. Even the angels spoke of her. Once Jibreel came to the Prophet and said, "Oh, Muhammad, give my salam to Khadija, and tell her that her Lord sends her salam, and gives her glad tidings of a palace in paradise, where there will be no noise and no tiredness." The Prophet's eyes filled with tears as he delivered the message, and Khadija smiled and said, "Allah is peace, and may peace be upon Jibreel and upon you, O Messenger of Allah." Her reply was simple, yet full of the faith that never left her. These moments were not just memories, they were lessons. They were pillars upon which the early believers stood when they faced torture. They remembered how Khadija gave her wealth when they lost homes. They remembered how Khadija opened hers when they felt fear. They remembered how she comforted the Prophet in the darkest hour. She was not just a wife. She was the heart of the mission before the mission was known, before the Quran was written, before the followers had names, before Islam had a place in the world. It had a place in her heart when pilgrims come to Makkah. Today many do not know that near the mountains in a quiet graveyard known as Jannah al-Mu'alla lies the resting place of the woman who changed the world without standing on a battlefield, without speaking to the crowds, without seeking praise. Her grave is simple, yet her story eternal. In every prayer, in every Ramadan, in every act of charity, her story lives. When a woman supports her husband in truth, when a person gives without being asked, when someone believes in goodness before it is popular, they walk in the shadow of Khadija. Her love was not a moment, it was a movement. Her strength was not loud but lasting, and her name will forever remain on the lips of those who know what it means to love, not with words, but with sacrifice. Why Hazrat Khadija was so beloved to Prophet Muhammad. The day the Prophet stood on the hills of Arafat during his final sermon, his voice echoed across thousands of souls. Yet in that powerful moment of farewell, his heart remembered the one who had once stood with him when no one else did, even as he addressed the nations of the world, even as he looked upon his companions with love and pride. A part of his heart quietly whispered her name. Khadija. He did not speak it aloud, but her presence was there, woven into every word into every lesson, into every tear that welled in his eyes as he looked at the people he had guided for 23 long years. A mission that began not in the battlefield, not in the court of a king, but in the small home in Mecca, where a woman believed in the truth before it became light for the world. When he returned from the farewell pilgrimage, he sat quietly in the corner of his home, surrounded by those who loved him, yet the place beside him where Khadija once sat always seemed to hold a silence deeper than speech. He would often walk alone near the walls of Medina, his thoughts drifting to moments when they used to walk together in Mecca, before the revelation, before the pain, before the migration, before the battles. Just him and her in peace and simplicity and hope. One evening, as the sun was setting, the Prophet sat with Fatima and looked at her closely. She had grown to look like her mother, not just in face, but in heart, in patience, in loyalty, in purity. He smiled and told her, "You are the queen of the women of Jannah, and your mother is the crown upon your head." Fatima cried, not from sadness, but from the weight of the legacy she carried, a legacy built not with gold or power, but with faith and sacrifice, with sleepless nights and silent tears, with hands that fed the poor, and hearts that never asked for reward. After the passing of the Prophet, when companions sat together and shared memories, they often spoke of Khadija, not just as the first wife, but as the first believer, the first to pray with the Prophet, the first to give her home, her wealth, her peace, her life to Islam. She had never fought with a sword, never given a public speech, yet her role was written in the heavens. One day Umar ibn Khattab asked Aisha about the Prophet's love for Khadija, and Aisha replied, "His love for her was not like the love of men, it was like the love of the soul for its origin. And even when I would speak of her with jealousy, the first could see that his heart still lived in her memory, and I could not compete with a woman who was praised by Jibril himself." Even Abu Bakr, the closest companion of the Prophet, would mention how during the darkest hours, when they were few in number, when the Quraysh plotted day and night, it was Khadija who reminded the Prophet that the path of truth is never easy, but always worth it, and that Allah never abandons his beloved. Her home had become the first place where the Quran was recited aloud. Her kitchen had fed the earliest Muslims. Her kindness had healed the tired, and her eyes had watched the Prophet every night as he returned from his mission, weary yet determined, and she never questioned, never doubted, never stepped back. The people of Makkah remembered her as a noble woman, but the people of Islam remembered her as a mother of the believers, not by title, but by action. And every time a believer broke fast in secret during the boycott, every time a child learned a verse of the Quran, every time a poor man was clothed by the Prophet, they tasted the barakah of Khadija's sacrifice. And in Jannah her reward waits a palace of pearls, where there is no noise, no pain, no sadness, a place promised by the Creator, a place built not with bricks, but with prayers and patience. For those who wonder what made her so beloved to the Prophet, the answer is simple. She gave when others took. She believed when others doubted. She stayed when others left. She smiled when others frowned. And above all, she stood beside him, not behind him, never in front of him, but beside him, as an equal, as a partner, as the first follower of a truth that would reach the corners of the earth. This story is not just of a wife and husband. It is the story of two souls written in the book of destiny, chosen to meet in this world and promised to meet again in the next. It is the story of a woman who lived with grace, died with honor, and rose in the ranks of eternity with light around her face. And as long as believers speak the name of the Prophet, the name of Khadija will rise beside his, for she was his comfort, his strength, his shelter, his silent support, and the first to say La ilaha illallah with a heart that had already known it long before the words were spoken. Her love was not loud but lasting. Her faith was not loud but unshakable. Her strength was not loud but unmatched. And that is why the greatest man to ever live remembered her. With every breath, with every prayer, with every heartbeat that carried her name, Khadija, the beloved of the Prophet. The mother of the believers, the light of the early days of Islam, the soul that lives in every act of true love, true sacrifice, and true faith. The end.